The winter of 1883 did not merely arrive, it descended like a shroud, a graveyard of broken promises and frozen dreams. In a small, shivering cabin nestled against the unforgiving slopes of the Black Hills, Sophia Montgomery was engaged in a desperate battle with the elements. She had already reached the point of no return, having dismantled her last kitchen chair to feed the dwindling flames of the hearth. The wood was gone, her strength was spent, and the darkness was closing in. One night, while she sat a mere heartbeat away from freezing to death, a heavy, thunderous fist hammered against her door. The sound was so violent it seemed to vibrate the very marrow of her bones. Standing in the heart of the howling blizzard was a giant of a man, a silhouette of fur and frost carved from the mountain itself. "Pack your things," he growled, his voice a low rumble that cut through the shrieking wind. "You're coming home." The Dakota Territory in January of 1883 was no place for the fragile or the faint of heart, and Sophia was rapidly running out of the will to endure. The wind screaming across the peaks wasn't just a weather pattern, it was a relentless, physical entity, a predator that battered the thin log walls of her isolated sanctuary. Inside, the frost had long since claimed the perimeter, creeping across the floorboards in thick, crystalline patterns that inched ever closer to the stone fireplace. There, the fire had faded into a pathetic cluster of dying orange embers, casting long, dancing shadows that looked like specters of her own demise. Sophia sat huddled on a low stool, wrapped in every quilt and scrap of fabric she owned. Her trembling hands clutched a tin cup of lukewarm water, which served as her only sustenance in 2 days. The pantry was a hollow tomb. Her last handful of flour had been baked into a hard, tasteless biscuit 3 days prior. The final scrap of salted pork had been stretched over an agonizing week, boiled repeatedly until nothing remained but gristle and the memory of salt. She was only 24 years old, but when she had caught a glimpse of herself in the cracked shard of a mirror earlier that afternoon, she hadn't recognized the woman staring back. The hollowed, sunken cheeks and the dull, lifeless eyes belonged to an old woman standing on the precipice of the grave. She was starving, and by her own grim reckoning, she had perhaps 1 night of life left before the cold and the hunger finally stilled her heart. Her husband, Thomas Montgomery, had been a man of vision, but those visions were often clouded by the glitter of distant horizons. He had uprooted her from the rolling green hills of Ohio, his eyes burning with gold fever and his mouth full of promises about a sprawling ranch in the fertile valleys. But Thomas, for all his ambition, had failed to grasp the brutal, uncompromising reality of the West. To finance a mining claim that ultimately yielded nothing but gray dust and backbreaking labor, he had borrowed heavily from Josiah Caldwell. Caldwell was the undisputed Shadow King of Deadwood, a ruthless, predatory banker with a soul as cold as a Dakota midnight. When Thomas died in November, the official cause was listed as pneumonia. However, Sophia knew the truth. She suspected the severe beating Thomas had sustained from Caldwell's debt collectors in town had ruined his lungs and broken his spirit long before the fever took him. He had left her with nothing but a worthless patch of frozen dirt and a target on her back. Caldwell's men had wasted no time, they had already seized the horses, the cattle, and the sturdy wagon. They had left her in the cabin to freeze, calculating that the winter would do their dirty work for them, clearing the deed so they could reclaim the land without a drop of blood on their hands. And they were nearly right. Sophia pulled the quilts tighter around her shoulders, squeezing her eyes shut as a particularly violent gust of wind rattled the heavy oak door. She prayed for the mercy of sleep to take her quickly. She prayed that she wouldn't have to wake up to the gnawing, sharp agony in her stomach or the terrifying silence of the mountain. Then, she heard it. Thud. 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 It wasn't the random lashing of the wind or the groaning of the timber. It was deliberate. It was heavy. It was rhythmic. Sophia froze, her breath catching in her parched throat. Her heart, which had been beating with a sluggish, weak rhythm just moments before, began to hammer violently against her ribs. Fear, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. Who could possibly be navigating this whiteout? Her mind immediately jumped to Harlon Miller. Miller was Caldwell's chief enforcer, a man whose reputation for cruelty was legendary. He wore a silver-studded gun belt and took a sadistic pleasure in terrorizing the vulnerable. He had visited her a month ago with a final warning: if she didn't vacate the premises by the new year, he would burn the cabin to the ground with her inside. Thud. 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 Open the door, Sophia. The voice was a deep, gravelly rumble that seemed to emanate from the earth itself, vibrating through the very logs of the cabin. It lacked the sharp, nasal twang that defined Harlon Miller's speech. Trembling with a mixture of terror and a strange, desperate hope, Sophia threw off the heavy blankets. Her legs felt like water, weak and shaking as they made contact with the freezing floorboards. She reached for the heavy iron poker resting in the hearth, her only weapon, and shuffled toward the entrance. Her numb fingers protested as she fumbled with the wooden latch. She managed to pull the door inward just a fraction, but the blizzard did the rest. The wind violently ripped the handle from her grasp, throwing the door wide open. Snow swirled into the dark cabin in a blinding vortex, bringing with it a blast of air so frigid it felt like serrated knives against her exposed skin. Filling the doorway, blocking out the storm, was a mountain of a man. He was clad in a massive, thick bearskin coat, its dark fur heavily dusted with snow. Ice clung to his dense, dark beard and the brim of his weathered slouch hat. Slung over his broad, powerful shoulder was a Henry repeating rifle. In that moment, he looked less like a mortal man and more like a primal force of nature, a wild creature birthed directly from the bowels of the blizzard. Sophia stumbled backward, her vision swimming as she raised the iron poker with a pathetic, shaking grip. "Get out," she rasped, her voice cracking with exhaustion. "I have nothing left to give. Tell Caldwell he's won. Just let me die in peace." The giant didn't move to strike or attack. He simply stepped into the cabin, reaching back to pull the heavy door shut. As the latch clicked, the deafening roar of the wind was instantly severed, replaced by a sudden, ringing quiet. In the dim light of the dying embers, he looked down at her. His eyes, barely visible beneath the shadow of his hat, were a piercing, stormy gray, the color of a thundercloud over the high peaks. It was Roman Boon. Every soul in Deadwood knew the name, though few could claim to have truly seen him. He was the legendary solitary trapper who made his home high up on Iron Peak, a man who descended only twice a year to trade furs for powder, lead, and coffee. He spoke to no one. The rumors surrounding him were as thick as the timber. Some said he was a former Texas Ranger who had executed his corrupt captain, others whispered he was a federal outlaw hiding from a hangman's noose, some even claimed he had lived among the Lakota for a decade. He was the ghost of the high country, a shadow among the pines. "Put the iron down, girl," Roman said. His voice was surprisingly calm, yet it possessed the heavy, undeniable weight of absolute authority. "You couldn't swing that thing hard enough to bruise a peach in your current state." What do you want?" Sophia whispered, her arm trembling so much she had to lower the poker an inch. She swayed on her feet, the sudden surge of adrenaline burning through the very last of her energy reserves. Roman's eyes swept the room with clinical precision. He took in the barren shelves, the cold hearth, and finally her gaunt, shivering frame. A small muscle feathered in his jaw, the only sign of emotion on his weathered face. He didn't bother answering her question directly. Instead, he unslung a heavy canvas sack from his back and dropped it onto the floor with a dull, heavy thud. "Pack your things," he growled again, pulling off his thick leather gloves to reveal hands scarred by years of hard labor and mountain life. "You're coming home." Sophia stared at him, her mind spinning in a fog of bewilderment. "Home? My home is in Ohio. I don't even know you, Mr. Boon. I'm not going anywhere with a stranger." Roman stepped forward, moving with a terrifying, silent grace that belied his massive size. He didn't ask, he simply reached out and took the iron poker from her hand, tossing it so it clattered onto the stone hearth. "You stay here, and you'll be a corpse by sunrise. I made a solemn promise to Thomas, and I intend to see it through." "Thomas?" Sophia gasped, her eyes widening as the name left his lips. "Thomas didn't know you. He feared the high country. He hated the mountains. Thomas knew me well enough to drag me out of a collapsed ravine 2 winters ago," Roman said bluntly, his gray eyes locking onto hers with a magnetic intensity. "My horse had broken its leg, and my ribs were shattered. He sat with me in a cramped snow cave for 2 days and kept me from the reaper. He saved my life." Roman paused, his voice dropping an octave. "A month before he passed, he rode all the way up to my claim. He told me he'd found something in his mine, something Caldwell was hungry for. He told me if anything ever happened to him, I was to come down and get you before Caldwell's hounds caught the scent." Sophia's head began to spin. Thomas had found something. He had never breathed a word of it to her. And he had secretly arranged for this wild, terrifying hermit to be her guardian? The room began to tilt at a sickening angle. The edges of her vision feathered into blackness. "I can't," she mumbled, her knees finally buckling. Before she could strike the freezing floorboards, Roman caught her. His arms were like bands of forged steel, yet they were surprisingly gentle as he lifted her light, malnourished frame entirely off the ground. Through the haze of her fading consciousness, she felt the coarse, musky warmth of his bearskin coat. She smelled pine smoke, raw leather, and the scent of the high wilderness. "Sleep, Sophia," he muttered, the vibration of his chest rumbling against her ear. "I've got you." When Sophia finally regained consciousness, the world was a blur of motion and sound. She wasn't in her cabin anymore. She was wrapped tightly in layers of heavy wool and buckskin, pressed firmly against a broad, solid back that felt as immovable as a cliffside. The howling of the wind was deafening, a chorus of screaming banshees. She forced her eyes open and was immediately blinded by the swirling white chaos of the blizzard. She was mounted on the back of a massive roan horse, a beast of incredible power, and she realized she was tied securely at the waist to Roman Boon, who sat in the saddle before her. He was acting as a human shield, his massive frame breaking the brunt of the storm as the horse plunged through snowdrifts that reached its chest. "Keep your face buried in my coat," Roman roared over the gale, sensing her movement. "Don't look up, or the air will freeze your lungs solid." Sophia didn't argue. She buried her face back into the thick, animal-scented fur. She was exhausted beyond measure, terrified of the height and the storm, and still half frozen. But beneath the layers of fear, a strange, flickering spark of warmth began to bloom in her chest. She wasn't alone. She wasn't a forgotten woman in a dying cabin. This man, a stranger bound by a debt of honor to a dead man, was physically fighting the mountain to save her life. The journey felt like a descent into an eternal white purgatory. Hours bled into one another as the horse, a powerful animal Roman called Samson, tirelessly pushed up the steep, treacherous inclines of Iron Peak. Several times, Samson stumbled on the hidden ice, and Roman would dismount without hesitation. He would plunge into waist-deep snow to lead the animal by the reins, physically carving a path through the drifts with his own body while Sophia clung to the saddle for dear life. Just as Sophia felt the icy grip of a final, permanent sleep pulling her under again, the wind abruptly died. The transition was jarring. They had breached the tree line, entering a dense, sheltered grove of ancient, towering pines that acted as a natural cathedral against the storm. Tucked against the lee side of a massive granite rock face was a sturdy, expertly crafted log cabin. Smoke poured merrily from its stone chimney, a golden beacon of life in a world of white death. Roman untied the bindings, lifting her from the saddle as if she weighed no more than a bundle of kindling, and carried her across the threshold. The blast of heat inside the cabin was intoxicating, nearly overwhelming her senses. It smelled of cured venison, cedar wood, and the rich, bitter aroma of strong coffee. Roman placed her gently onto a bed piled high with thick pelt blankets, buffalo, beaver, and wolf. Over the course of the next 3 days, Sophia drifted in and out of a feverish, restorative sleep. Every time her eyes fluttered open, Roman was there. The gruff, terrifying mountain man had transformed into a quiet, constant caregiver. With surprising dexterity for his large hands, he spoon-fed her rich, salty bone broth that seemed to pour life back into her veins. He kept the fireplace roaring until the cabin glowed with warmth. He even applied foul-smelling but soothing warm poultices to her blackened, frost-bitten toes. As her physical strength slowly returned, so did her awareness of the man himself. There was an intense, unspoken tension that filled the small cabin. Roman rarely spoke unless it was absolutely necessary. He spent his daylight hours repairing steel traps, meticulously cleaning his firearms, or standing by the small window, his stormy eyes scanning the white expanse of the mountain trails below. He was a deeply handsome man beneath the layer of trail grit and the thick beard, possessing sharp, almost aristocratic features that seemed out of place with his rough, functional clothing. On the 4th evening, Sophia felt strong enough to sit by the fire. Wrapped in a heavy blanket, she watched him oil the lever action of a Winchester rifle. "You said Thomas found something," Sophia said, her voice finally losing its ragged edge. "What exactly was it?" Roman paused, the oiled rag freezing in mid-air. He looked up at her, the dancing firelight reflecting in his gray eyes. "He found a vein, Sophia. Not gold, silver. The richest, purest vein anyone's ever seen in these territories. It's located right beneath that patch of dirt Caldwell sold him, thinking it was a dry hole. But Thomas was smarter than people gave him credit for. He didn't register the amended claim in town where Caldwell's spies could see it. He mapped it out, hid the document, and then, well, Caldwell caught wind of the rumors." Sophia's breath hitched in her throat. "So Thomas didn't die of a fever?" "No," Roman said softly, his voice tight with a suppressed, lethal anger. "Harlon Miller beat him to within an inch of his life, trying to squeeze the location of that map out of him. Thomas never broke. He held out until the end. But Caldwell knows you're the last link. He thinks you have it. That's why he's been trying to starve you out. He wanted you desperate enough to trade whatever Thomas left behind for a single sack of flour." Tears pricked Sophia's eyes, a volatile mix of grief for her husband and rage at the men who had destroyed him. "I don't have a map, Roman. I don't know anything about a silver vein. He never told me." "I know," Roman said, setting the rifle aside with a soft click. He stood up and walked over to a heavy iron lockbox sitting on a high, shadowed shelf. He brought it down, produced a small brass key from a cord around his neck, and opened it. He pulled out a folded piece of heavy, weathered parchment and handed it to her. Thomas gave it to me. Sophia stared at the intricate drawings, immediately recognizing her husband's neat, disciplined handwriting. Why? Why give it to you? Because he knew Caldwell would kill you the moment he got his hands on it. He figured if I had it, I could protect it. He wanted me to sell the information to a rival mining syndicate in Denver, someone big enough to crush Caldwell, and set up a trust in your name. He wanted you to go back to Ohio as a wealthy woman, Sophia. Roman looked away then, his gaze fixed on the glowing embers of the fire. He trusted me to keep you alive until the spring thaw. Sophia looked down at the map, then back up at the giant of a man who had snatched her from the jaws of the Reaper. And what about you, Roman? What do you get out of this arrangement? He finally looked back at her, and for the first time, she saw a profound, heavy sorrow lurking in his gaze. I pay off a debt to a man who saved me, he whispered. And maybe I buy back a small fraction of my soul. Before Sophia could press him on what he meant, a sound shattered the quiet intimacy of the cabin. Outside, Roman's 3 large hunting hounds erupted into a chorus of vicious, frantic barking. It wasn't the sound they made when a predator like a wolf or a mountain lion was prowling near. It was a specific, aggressive pitch reserved for the scent of men. Roman's demeanor shifted instantly. The quiet caregiver vanished, replaced by a cold, hardened killer. He grabbed the Winchester from the table, levering around into the chamber with a sharp, metallic clack-clack. He moved to the window, peering through a small crack in the heavy wooden shutters. "What is it?" Sophia whispered, her blood turning to ice. "Looks like Caldwell got tired of waiting for the weather to finish you off," Roman said, his voice flat and devoid of any emotion. Sophia crept to the window beside him, her heart thumping against her ribs. Down below, struggling up the narrow, winding mountain path through the waist-deep snow, were 6 men on horseback. Even in the fading twilight, Sophia recognized the man leading the pack. It was Harlon Miller, his silver-studded gun belt visible over a heavy winter duster. They had followed the deep, frozen track Samson had left in the snow. "They brought dynamite," Roman noted grimly, pointing to a wooden crate strapped to a pack mule. "They aren't here to talk or negotiate, Sophia. They're here to blow this cabin off the face of Iron Peak, take the map from my corpse, and bury you in the rubble." Roman turned to face her. The vulnerability she had glimpsed earlier was gone, locked away behind a wall of pure, lethal ice. He reached into the folds of his coat and pulled out a heavy Colt revolver, pressing the cold steel into her hands. "Get into the root cellar beneath the floorboards," he ordered, his eyes burning into hers. "Do not come out, no matter what you hear. If that trapdoor opens and it isn't me, you empty this gun into whoever is standing there. Do you understand me, Sophia?" "Roman, there are 6 of them," Sophia cried, her fingers gripping his muscular arm. "They'll kill you." A dark, dangerous smirk pulled at the corner of the mountain man's mouth. "They're welcome to try. But they're a long way from town, Sophia. Up here, this is my mountain. And I do not take kindly to trespassers." The root cellar smelled of damp earth, old potatoes, and suffocating terror. Sophia sat huddled on a wooden crate in the pitch blackness, the heavy Colt revolver gripped so tightly in both hands that her knuckles ached. Above her, the thick timber floorboards muffled the sounds of the brewing storm, but they did nothing to block the sounds of the approaching violence. She heard the heavy wooden shutters slam shut and the iron bar slide into place. Then came a silence. A terrible, agonizing silence that stretched for what felt like an eternity, broken only by the frantic drumming of her own heart. Where was Roman? Then came the voice, distorted by the wind but unmistakably belonging to Harlon Miller. "Boon. We know she's in there. Caldwell don't want no trouble with a man like you, mountain man. Send the girl out with the papers, and we'll ride away. You have my word." A solitary gunshot rang out, a sharp, deafening crack from Roman's Winchester. But it wasn't fired from inside the cabin. It came from outside, somewhere in the dense tree-line behind the structure. A man screamed, a wet, gurgling sound that was quickly swallowed by the wind. "He's outside!" Harlon roared. "Burn it! Throw the powder!" Sophia squeezed her eyes shut and braced herself. Boom! The explosion was catastrophic. The entire cabin violently shuddered as if struck by a giant's hammer. Dirt rained down from the cellar ceiling, coating Sophia's hair and shoulders. The deafening blast sent a physical shockwave through the floorboards, rattling her teeth in her skull. A second explosion followed almost immediately, tearing away what sounded like the entire front porch. The sharp, acrid smell of sulfur and burning pine instantly filtered through the cracks in the floor. Gunfire erupted in a chaotic, staggering rhythm. It was a blind panic of revolvers and repeating rifles, answered only by the methodical, terrifyingly precise crack-lever-crack of Roman's Winchester from the shadows of the pines. He wasn't defending the cabin, he had used it as bait. He was hunting them in the blizzard, a ghost moving through the very elements they were struggling to survive. For 20 minutes, a brutal, one-sided war raged above Sophia. She heard men shouting in blind panic, horses screaming in terror, and the low, guttural snarling of Roman's hounds as they were loosed upon the attackers. Then, heavy boots slammed onto the remaining floorboards directly above her head. Someone had breached the perimeter. "Check the back." Harlon's voice barked, sounding breathless and frantic. "He ain't a man. I swear to God, he ain't a man. Just find the paper and let's get out of here." Sophia held her breath, her lungs burning as she raised the heavy barrel of the Colt toward the trapdoor above her. The heavy, irregular thud of Harlon's boots moved across the room. She heard him tossing furniture aside, ripping pelts from the bed in a mad search. He was looking for the lockbox, but Roman had been too smart, he had taken it with him into the storm. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. Directly above her head. "Well, well," Harlon muttered. Sophia heard the metallic scrape of an iron ring being lifted. Light suddenly pierced the darkness as the trapdoor was violently yanked open. Harlon Miller loomed in the opening, a flickering kerosene lantern in one hand and a revolver in the other. His face was smeared with soot and blood, his eyes wide with a manic, desperate energy. He looked down, his gaze locking onto Sophia. A cruel, jagged smile twisted his lips. "Found the prize." He aimed his revolver down into the hole. Sophia didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She remembered Roman's words and the fire in his eyes. She aimed for center mass, squeezed her eyes shut, and pulled the heavy trigger. The Colt roared in the confined space, the muzzle flashed temporarily blinding her. The savage recoil snapped her wrists back, sending the gun clattering against the dirt wall. Harlon let out a sharp, choked gasp, dropping the lantern. It shattered on the cellar floor, the kerosene instantly igniting in a pool of orange flames. But Sophia had missed his chest in her panic. The heavy lead ball had instead shattered his collarbone. Snarling in agony, Harlon dropped his own gun and lunged down the ladder with his good arm, grabbing Sophia by the hair with a savage yank. "I'm going to snap your neck, you little." Before Harlon could finish the threat, a massive shadow eclipsed the trapdoor above. Roman reached down, his giant hand wrapping around the back of Harlon's thick winter coat like a predator seizing its prey. With a raw, guttural roar of fury, the mountain man hauled the screaming enforcer entirely out of the cellar with one arm. Sophia scrambled up the ladder, choking on the black smoke from the spilled kerosene. She emerged into the ruined cabin just in time to see Roman hurl Harlon against the stone hearth. The enforcer scrambled for a fallen weapon, but Roman didn't give him the chance. He drew a heavy, stag-handled hunting knife and drove it to the hilt into Harlon's chest. Harlon slumped to the floor, his eyes glassy and vacant, dead before he fully settled onto the floorboards. Roman stood over him, his chest heaving with exertion. His bearskin coat was scorched and peppered with bullet holes. A steady stream of dark blood ran down his left arm, dripping off his fingertips and onto the wood. Outside, the wind howled over the silent bodies of Caldwell's remaining men. Roman slowly turned to Sophia. The icy, killing rage in his gray eyes melted away the moment he saw her standing there, safe, covered in soot, but unharmed. He took a single, staggering step toward her. Then his knees buckled. Sophia rushed forward, catching the giant man before he hit the ground, lowering him gently to the floor amidst the wreckage of the battle. The rest of that bitter winter was spent in the slow process of rebuilding, both the cabin and themselves. The bullet had passed cleanly through Roman's shoulder, but the significant blood loss and the subsequent fever nearly claimed the life that the blizzard and the gunman could not. For 2 weeks, the roles were reversed, and Sophia became the primary caregiver. She stitched his torn flesh with a bone needle and silk thread, bathed his feverish brow with snowmelt, and kept the fire roaring day and night. During those long, delirious nights, the truth of Roman Boon finally spilled from his fever-cracked lips. He wasn't an outlaw hiding from justice. He was a former United States Deputy Marshal. 5 years ago, Josiah Caldwell hadn't been a banker. He was a notorious rustler operating out of the Montana Territory. Roman had tracked Caldwell's gang for months, eventually cornering them in a box canyon. In the ensuing firefight, Roman had shot and killed Caldwell's younger brother. Caldwell had escaped, taking the gang's stolen fortune and reinventing himself as a legitimate banker in Deadwood. He had placed a staggering, illegal bounty on Roman's head, forcing the lawman into a lonely exile in the high peaks to avoid a never-ending stream of greedy bounty hunters. Thomas didn't just find silver, Roman rasped one night, his gray eyes clear but heavy with exhaustion as Sophia changed his bandages. He found an old strongbox buried in his claim, left over from Caldwell's rustling days. It contained ledgers, Sophia, ledgers detailing every stolen dollar, every bribed judge, and every homestead they burned to build that bank. Caldwell didn't want the silver. He wanted the paper that would put a rope around his neck. Sophia stared at him, the pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. "And the map you showed me?" A map to where Thomas reburied that strongbox deep in a collapsed shaft. A place where Caldwell's men couldn't dig without bringing the entire mountain down on their heads. Roman reached out, his rough, calloused fingers gently brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. "Thomas knew I was the only man Caldwell truly feared. He knew I'd protect the evidence, and he knew I'd protect you." As the deep freeze of February gave way to the gentler, moisture-laden winds of March, a profound shift occurred between them. The trauma that had thrown them together forged a bond thicker than blood and stronger than the mountain itself. Sophia found herself watching the play of muscles in Roman's back as he chopped wood, feeling a deep, yearning ache in her chest she had never known. Roman, in turn, softened his rugged exterior. The hardened mountain man began to carve intricate wooden figures for her by the fire, his stormy eyes tracking her every movement with a fierce, protective devotion. One evening, as the first signs of the spring thaw dripped musically from the eaves, Roman stood by the window. "The pass will be clear in a week," he said quietly, his back to her. "We'll ride down to Cheyenne. There's a federal judge there I trust. We hand over those ledgers, Caldwell hangs, and you sell that silver claim to the Union Pacific Syndicate. You'll have enough money to buy half of Ohio, Sophia. Sophia stopped sweeping the floor. She looked at the man who had pulled her from the jaws of death, who had bled for her, and who had given her a reason to keep breathing. "And what will you do, Roman?" she asked softly. He finally turned to her, a mask of stoic resignation firmly back in place. "My debt to Thomas is paid. My debt to Caldwell will be settled. I reckon I'll head further up into the high timber. Wyoming, maybe Montana. It's getting too crowded around here now." Sophia dropped the broom. She crossed the room, stepping directly into his personal space and forcing him to look down at her. She reached up, placing her hands flat against his broad, warm chest, feeling the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart beneath the worn cotton of his shirt. "You knocked on my door in the middle of a blizzard," Sophia said, her voice trembling but filled with an iron resolve. "You told me to pack my things, that I was coming home." She looked up into his stormy gray eyes, letting him see the absolute certainty in her own. "Did you lie to me, Roman Boon?" Roman stared at her, the stoic mask shattering into 1,000 pieces. His hands, massive and scarred, came up to tentatively cup her face, holding her as if she were made of the finest, most fragile glass in the world. "No," he whispered, his voice thick with a sudden, overwhelming emotion. "I didn't lie." He leaned down, and when their lips finally met, it wasn't just a spark. It was a wildfire. It was the heat of the spring thaw wiping away the bitter memory of winter. It was a promise of life and survival sealed in a single, desperate embrace. By May of 1883, the town of Deadwood witnessed a spectacle they would talk about for decades to come. Josiah Caldwell was dragged, kicking and screaming, from his opulent, mahogany-lined bank by a squad of federal marshals. The damning ledgers were clutched firmly in the hands of a federal judge who could not be bought. Records from the Cheyenne Assay office that same year show the registration of the incredibly lucrative Iron Peak Silver Company. It wasn't sold to a faceless syndicate. It was owned outright by Sophia Boon. Sophia didn't return to Ohio. Instead, she took her newfound fortune and purchased a massive, sprawling ranch in the lush, emerald valleys just below the shadow of Iron Peak. She built a house with a wide, wraparound porch, a massive stone hearth, and enough rooms for the children that would soon fill its halls with laughter. And standing beside her, no longer a ghost of the timber but a man fiercely grounded in the world of the living, was her mountain man. He had kept his promise. He had truly brought her home. We would love to hear from you. Tell us in the comments which part of the world you are watching from. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow story lovers and subscribe to the Kindness Hour channel for more epic, dramatic, and inspiring tales. See you in the next one.